So there's a new trend developing of former players having a go at modern day players and modern day players having a bit of a bite back. So this weekend, Rob, you were at Old Trafford and you were down in the mix zone. You spoke to Lisandro Martinez, who wasn't very happy about some comments made by Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt last week ahead of his game against Erling Haaland. They were both suggesting that he would be thrown about like a toddler, I think was the word by Erling Haaland, and that he would have a great game. Now, I think we both know that Lisandro Martinez's record against Haaland is pretty good. I think there's only one game that he scored Haaland against Martinez in 5 or 6 games. So anyway, so talk me through Lisandro Martinez and how he bit back at Paul Scholes.
Yeah, so I'm not. The mix zone at clubs will work in different ways. At Man United, you sort of leave the press box, you walk down right by the side of the pitch, and the players sort of speak to you in the tunnel area. Now, sometimes if it's a defeat or a bad result, players won't speak to you at all. If it's a good result, like it was with United on Saturday against City, the club will try to bring you a player to speak about it. Now, often in these cases, players just want to speak about the game and what's happened on the pitch for the 90 minutes beforehand. Other times, there have been situations where players have got certain things to say because they've got something they want to get off their chest. Now, when we were told that it was going to be Lisandro Martinez, we were also told that he had something to say. We kind of worked out pretty quickly that it was going to be about what Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt said about him in their podcast before the Manchester derby. Now, United were upset about those, or disappointed is probably a better word, about those comments that you just mentioned. I think Nicky Butt said that the battle between Martinez and Haaland was going to resemble a dad after school picking a toddler up and taking him to the car. And then Scholes, I think, said something like Haaland's going to score and then throw Martinez in the net with the ball, something along those lines. Now, United felt that kind of crossed the line from constructive analysis into trying to mock one of their players, which, I can kind of understand the point they were trying to make. And, after the first question gets put to Lisandro Martinez about the game, the second one is about these comments from Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt. And clearly he had his response ready and waiting and sort of said, if he wants, he can come to my house and he can say it to my face that he sees them at Old Trafford when they've come to games and no one ever says anything to me. They're kind of essentially saying these pundits sit in a TV studio or a podcast studio and say what they want in front of a TV or a microphone, but when it's face to face, they haven't got the guts to do it, to the person straight face to face. So, it's fair from Martinez to bite back if pundits are going to kind of have their say in that kind of way. Then Martinez is more than entitled to give his say as well. I think that he felt like it was deserved, particularly after he's come off a game where he's essentially proved Scholes and Butt completely wrong, that they thought that Haaland was going to win that battle. Martinez, I think, clearly won it and helped United win the game and record a really important result for Michael Carrick.
I think we have to say that Paul Scholes responded about an hour after your copy landed, Robin, and Scholes said, someone's had a good game, haven't they? Tea and 2 sugars, please. So I think the reality is that, knowing Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt a little bit, I know that their views come from a sense of they're big United fans and they don't like the way the team is playing right now. They feel hurt that the club is in this way, but you have to accept as well that Lisandro Martinez was probably even born when these two were at the peak, so he doesn't quite know how good of players they were and how important they were to Man United's history. So they will be seen as two old men that are making their life a misery. So I do think that he's probably picked on the wrong two there, because I think Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt are the two that are least likely to say, sorry, mate, I've put my hands up. They'll probably say yes when you want to meet us. I mean, that's a good thing or not, but it's great for us. But I do think that a lot of fans also get on the backs of the legends for not being supportive. But I guess if these guys have seen how a club can be successful, and they see the club not being successful, and the reasons why they believe are because they're not honouring certain traditions or philosophies, then they are entitled to an opinion. They're being critical, but they're being supportive at the same time. So I think some fans and some players have to grow a thicker skin when these legends are making their comments, because these guys have earned the right because they've won everything at clubs, not just Man United. I mean, Beth, we know that Mo Salah's had a few issues with Jamie Carragher, and Jamie Carragher, again, apart from the Premier League, he won everything for Liverpool. So the fact that he's not won the Premier League is often held against Jamie Carragher. You can't say this because he didn't do that, but he won everything else. He's a bona fide Liverpool legend. So why doesn't he have the right to say things about Mo Salah and Virgil van Dijk? Why are they being so thin-skinned and sensitive about it?
Yeah, I think that the thing with Mo Salah, obviously, he name drops Jamie Carragher in that pretty explosive run that he had at Leeds. And I think Salah's frustration stemmed from the fact, I think he felt like he was being... I think he felt probably like Martinez felt like it crossed the line from being a constructive criticism of of him or his game, and it had become a bit of a personal vendetta a little bit with Carragher, because he'd mentioned him quite a few times, and Carragher sort of doubled down on it on Monday Night Football a few nights later, and sort of said, well, and he did make it quite personal, because he went on about him not being successful with his country, and so I understood to an extent why Salah was frustrated. I think he used Carragher maybe as like a representation of the media, because the media as a collective this season has probably been quite critical of Mo Salah, and yes, a lot of that criticism has been warranted, but Salah would probably be within his rights to say, well, listen, I helped carry this team to a title last season. I'm not entitled a little bit of grace, and so I understand it to an extent, but then also I agree with you, Mark, in the sense that these ex-players, they know what it takes to be successful at clubs. A lot of them support the clubs, or have played for them since they were children, basically, and care about them in the way that fans do, and so sometimes the comments are rooted in frustration and genuine just emotion. And I think as far as the Martinez one goes, I mean, I can understand why he felt that was maybe a little bit personal and not constructive in terms of the criticism. But one of my sort of overarching memories of Martinez was when they got I think it must have been the 2-2 draw at Anfield earlier in 2025, when Martinez scored, didn't he? And he came out and gave an interview afterwards, and he got asked, what's different this time? How were you able to get this performance? And he just sort of tapped his head and went, mentality. And I remember thinking, if I was a Manchester United fan and I was watching that, I would be absolutely livid, because he's essentially said, like, they've switched on because it's a big game. So I think, I can understand where that frustration does come from fans and from pundits. And I also think, Virgil van Dijk has had it a couple of times with Wayne Rooney. There was a little bit of a back and forth between the two of them a couple of months back when Rooney criticised his leadership, and Van Dijk, to be fair, sort of, he bit back a bit, but then he also sort of said, I understand that he has a job to do, and listen, a lot of these players probably once they retire will go on to do the same thing, and we know what it's like when you've got an hour to fill up a podcast, or an hour, you write multiple articles a week, and you've got things that you need to say and topics that you need to talk about, and so sometimes there is going to be inevitably criticism or things that players don't like that creeps in, but I suppose it's whether it crosses that line and becomes a little bit too personal.
I think it goes in cycles, doesn't it? Because if you look at Liverpool, Liverpool were the best team of the 70s and 80s, which means that their players were the most famous. And so when they were looking for pundits in the 90s, there were ex-players like Alan Hansen, who had really high-profile punditry gigs on Match of the Day in the UK. And so when he said something about Liverpool, it really matters, because he was, had been part of such a successful team there. And the same thing is happening with Man United now. United were the best team of the 90s and 2000s, which meant that that group of players is the most famous of that era, that their word matters, and they get big punditry gigs. Gary Neville works on Sky Sports in the UK. Roy Keane is another one on the same channel. Paul Scholes was a pundit on TNT and now has obviously a high profile podcast. And so when these players, these high profile players who have won an awful lot with that club, and that club is then not performing properly, their opinion, carries an awful lot of weight. And not to disrespect any of the pundits out there, but people like, say Danny Murphy, for example, who was also a pundit in the UK, a very successful career with Liverpool and England. If he was to say something about Man United, people will probably go, okay, but it doesn't carry the same weight as a Gary Neville or a Roy Keane or a Paul Scholes because of what they have achieved at that club. And so when these pundits say things, it automatically becomes a bigger deal. So, even in Michael Carrick's first press conference on Friday before the City game, one of the first questions he's asked is about Roy Keane and some of the comments that Roy Keane has already made about Michael Carrick. Now, that wouldn't happen if it's Danny Murphy or anyone else. And it adds pressure onto Michael Carrick straight away. The players, again, it could have been any number of players brought to the mix zone after the City game. Well, we had an incident earlier in the season where Luke Shaw has had a relatively good game. And in the mix zone, someone has said, oh, by the way, did you see Roy Keane a couple of weeks ago? He was questioning whether you have the right mentality to play for Man United. Now, those comments were a week apart, but yet Luke Shaw is still having to answer things that Roy Keane has said a month earlier. And it does add more pressure, I think, for the players. I mean, lots of fans will listen to this and go, well, if you're playing for Man United, you have to deal with it anyway. The pressure comes from all angles. Deal with it. And I appreciate that. That is true. If you're going to sign for Man United, you have to deal with it. But because of these ex-players, what they've achieved, the profile that they've got, if they say something negative about you, whether you're a player or a manager, it does add extra pressure and extra scrutiny. And it is something extra that you have to deal with.
It's funny, though, it's a case of be careful what you wish for, because basically, what was it, 10, 15 years when Man City started their rise under Sheikh Mansour, at the time, you mentioned them, Rob, the Alan Hansons and Mark Lawrensons, the ex-Liverpool players, the greats of the Liverpool 1980s era, were the most prominent pundits. And people at Man City just couldn't get it into their head that these guys were always, every week, the Liverpool legends were saying this about Man City, and Man City had no legends in the media, because they accepted that kind of, that 10, 15, 20 years prior to that, when they would become legends, they didn't have any players that were worthy of being legends. They had a team of misfits in the 1990s and 1980s. Nobody wanted a Man City legend from those days because they didn't have any legends. So City actually made it a kind of they had an actual drive to get ex-players into the media. So you'll have seen, Joe Hart, Pablo Zabaleta, Vincent Kompany for a while. Obviously, we know that Nadum, who works with us. Again, the City are Micah Richards, they want their voices in the media so that when there are issues to address in Man City, they've got somebody fighting their corner. So, if Man City being criticised, the 115 charges comes up quite a lot, then they've got somebody who can put the club's perspective and fight the corner against the Liverpool legends, the Man United legends. So as it stands right now, City are in a good place because they're generally winning and they've not got a lot to say negative about them. But the time will come when these ex-City players will get frustrated with the way things are going and start having a go. And then the players, 3 or 4 years down the line that aren't winning, that aren't successful as they are now, will be complaining about these ex-players that are having a go. So it goes around in circles. If you're winning, the players are quiet. They don't have anything to say. But when you're losing, that's when the legends come through. But we'll see how it goes. But, Man United and Liverpool, the two biggest clubs in the country, the two of the biggest clubs in the world, they've got a lot of great ex-players with voice in the media. It's one of those things. And, like you say, Rob, sometimes if you can't deal with it, then don't be there. I read an interview with Christian Eriksen a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, Christian Eriksen is now at Wolfsburg. And within the piece, Christian Eriksen was talking about how hard it is to play for Man United, how when you win a trophy, they don't celebrate it because it's not a big enough trophy, how the legends are always having a go. You want to shut the door behind you and cut out the noise. And it's like, mate, if that's what you think about playing for Man United, don't play for Man United, because it comes with the territory. You're playing for one of the biggest clubs in the world that have big demands. If you want to close the door behind you and turn off the noise and celebrate winning the EFL Cup, then fine. But that's not what being a Man United player is about. And that gets back to why Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt and Gary Neville are finding fault. It's why Jamie Carragher will find fault in Mo Salah if he's not doing enough, because these players want their team to win and be as successful as they were when they were playing for them. So it's a good thing to have demanding pundits. It's a good thing to have demanding legends, because it shows that demanding the club be back at the standards that they expect and that they've fallen from. But Man City haven't had it yet, but it'll come.
I think that just shows how difficult it is. You talk about Christian Eriksen there and not being able to celebrate the Carabao Cup or the FA Cup. Well, the generation of the pundits now have come from, the Carabao Cup or the FA Cup wouldn't have meant much to them because they won 12 Premier League titles, 2 European Cups, and every other domestic cup that was on offer. Now, it probably raises a question: is it possible for a team to dominate now, like United were able to dominate in the 90s and 2000s? And probably not. I mean, you look at even City now. City have won 4 Premier League titles in a row and didn't win last year and look like they're going to struggle to catch Arsenal this year. It's difficult when you're a player at Man United, and those comments from Eriksen kind of prove it. And there was always that story that people at United told about Alexis Sanchez. That there is this thing about the pressure on Man United being, is the spotlight on Man United greater than it is on any other club, bar sort of Real Madrid and Barcelona? And there are people at United who will tell you that it is. The Alexis Sanchez one, he came from Barcelona, did really well there, played in the Premier League for Arsenal, again did really well. Everyone at United thought it was an absolute no-brainer to sign him. He came to Old Trafford, he failed miserably, and there were quite high-up execs at the time who felt that part of the problem was that he just couldn't handle the scrutiny and the pressure that came with playing for Man United. Now, it's all well and good saying that for a player who's maybe come from, I don't know, Leicester or Southampton or somewhere where they're not used to winning trophies all the time. But they were saying this about a guy who's come from Barcelona and Arsenal, who come to United and they felt still couldn't handle the pressure. Now, that tells you everything about the environment that people think that they've created at Old Trafford. That if a guy who's been there and seen it and done everything can't perform, then what hope is there for everyone else? And the pressure and the the scrutiny from ex-players and pundits plays into that.
I think it's great, though. I think it's great to hear these ex-players have an opinion, and I think it all adds to the kind of the craziness of the Premier League. And if you're a Liverpool or Man United player and you're wanting to be successful, it'll be your turn in 10 years' time to have that say about other players that are coming through that aren't doing as well. So that's the price of playing for a big club. And I think play for Real Madrid, Barcelona, Liverpool, Man United. Bayern Munich, look at the players that they've got. Look at the ex-players that they've got all the time. Uli Hoeneß, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, all the Lothar Matthäus. That's the part of playing for a big club. You're going to get great former players. Somebody once said to me, an agent of a player said to me, his player would sign for Man United and he was struggling to basically cope, as you said, with people like Alexis Sanchez. He said, you have to realise that the Man United shirt is the heaviest in football. And I said, what do you mean? He says, you go through that team 1 to 11, every single player, every single position has got an iconic former player that you have to live up to. So if you're a right back, you've got to be as good as Dennis Irwin or Gary Neville. If you're a goalkeeper, you've got to be Peter Schmeichel or Edwin van der Sar. If you're a striker, Ruud van Nistelrooy, Cristiano Ronaldo, Teddy Sheringham, Dwight York, Eric Cantona. So I can see the point of the pressure that comes with playing for these big clubs, but that is something that you have to embrace. And if you don't embrace it, like Christian Eriksen didn't, then he's now at Wolfsburg in the Bundesliga, bottom half of the table. That may be his level. So if you've got the mentality to play for a big club, you can handle all the stuff that comes from the side. So, it's a heavy shirt, but you got to deal with it.